This episode of New Politics was released on the 6th of December, 2025, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
This is the next part of our review of federal politics in 2025, and we're looking at the big election victory for the Labor government and the collapse of the Liberal Party, the failures over the genocide in Gaza, and the influence over the media by powerful interest groups. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this is coming up in this big episode of New Politics.
And just a reminder that New Politics is produced by independent media. You can listen in, share, subscribe and support New Politics at Patreon and Substack. It's just $5 per month. Or you can donate directly at our website at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, all of this is a good way to support independent journalism.
It was a vote for continuity at a time of global uncertainty. Anthony Albanese clinching a second consecutive three-year term as Australian Prime Minister, the first to do so in 21 years.
My fellow Australians, Australians have chosen the Australian Labor Party as their government. We do not need to beg or borrow or copy from anywhere else. We do not seek our inspiration overseas.
The big political event for the year was the federal election in May, and there were several other elections in state and territories, but the big political event was the federal election. And the first half of the year was the build-up to the campaign itself and speculation about when the election was going to be called. That went on for so long that we all got sick of it, that speculation, even though for some time the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, said that the election was going to be held in May. No one seemed to listen to him, but various commentators, including us, said that it was one of the worst.
You'd think he'd have some idea, wouldn't you?
You'd think so. And various commentators said that it was the worst campaign that they had ever seen. And it was pretty much a contest between a competent but very uninspiring first-term Labor government and one of the worst leaders of a political party that we've ever seen, the leader of the Liberal Party, Peter Dutton. And as far as election campaigns are concerned, it could not have been worse for the Liberal Party. They ended up having their biggest election loss in their history, but everything pretty much fell into place for Anthony Albanese and the Labor government. And even though the campaign itself was uninspiring, you can only campaign against whatever is put up against you. But on the politics and on the strategy, well, it was almost a perfect campaign. They ended up winning 94 seats, but I think that was to be expected when you're up against the worst political leader in Australia's history and also up against the worst campaign ever from the Liberal Party.
Now, I would argue that it wasn't the worst campaign, but it was the first shocking campaign that didn't work for them. The Morrison campaign was terrible. The Turnbull campaign was terrible. The Abbott campaign with the fake tradie and biting into the onion and all of that was just appalling. And Abbott running out of Parliament to stop voting for something. Those were much worse. But for some reason, the public tended to ignore it. Finally, they had a campaign that was not good. It was a terrible campaign in which the public stopped listening and finally saw this doesn't work. Now, a lot of that may have been to do with Peter Dutton's almost inexplicable unpopularity, like so unpopular that it was hard to explain how he got into office anyway, but also how he survived so long. We'd predicted that he wouldn't get to the election, and he did. That's one on us, one to learn from. He became the first opposition leader to lose his seat as opposition leader, and he lost it pretty badly too. And in fact, I thought Ali Francis had 3 goes at it. He'll probably scrape in again, but no, the times were with her, and congratulations to Ali France, of course. I was pleased that she got in. I just made the mistake of past performance being an indicator of present performance. And she, as far as I'm told too, she's been a really great local member. So I'm happy to, all the things I said, I don't think Ali can make it, I'm happy to take them all back, praise what she's good at. which is being a great local member, which is what the people of Dixon had been looking for. Just took them a few election cycles to realise that. And that's okay.
Well, better late than never.
And better late than never. I think Dutton's hard right. We've fallen into the trap of calling some of these things far. I think hard right is a better term. Dutton's hard right approach really didn't appeal to Australians as on a whole. Whereas Labor's, depending on how cynical you are, soft left to soft right to hard centre approach worked. I would call the current Labor government a centrist government. I know others disagree, and that's perfectly fine. And tell us about it in the comments if you think that they're not centrist, if you think there's something else. But the coalition almost campaigned as if they knew they were going to lose too. And yeah, Labor was a sure thing, but we've seen McMahon in 72 lost the election, but he did a lot better than everyone thought. It wasn't a landslide in 72. It was...
Oh, well, they had their landslide in 1969, although it didn't result in a victory for the Labor Party.
Yeah, 69...
I think they had a 7% swing towards them in 1969, but that was not enough to win, and then they ended up consolidating the victory in 1972.
Yeah, but the McMahon government was able to hold off another 7% swing, and McMahon was, until recently, considered the worst Prime Minister in Australian history. Till the Liberal Party said, oh no, hold my beer, we can do much worse than this. Dutton, of course, ran on negative and presented no policy. Now, the interesting thing, too, is that he may have been let down by an incompetent shadow cabinet just before Andrew Hastie allegedly launched his leadership challenge against Suzanne Lee a couple months back. Documents were released showing that he was a terrible shadow minister. He didn't do the work required. He didn't develop policy. He spent most of his time not doing the work of a shadow minister. And I think that was a targeted leak, but I think you'd find, I'm guessing there are more documents showing that Dutton was let down by an incompetent shadow ministry.
Oh, for sure. And it is about the team within an election campaign, but it's the leader, essentially, in modern-day Australian elections that the electorate tends to vote for. But the signs for an election day thumping, I think they were there well before election day itself. And late last year, if we go back to roughly October, November in 2024, there was talk about Peter Dutton becoming the next Prime Minister. I think they already had the number 32 on his jumper signed up, Prime Minister number 32, and he was having favourable polls and all that sort of stuff. But that was all way before people woke up to themselves and realised what this guy is all about. But and just going a little bit forward to January onwards, for most of this year, the opinion polls suggested that Labor was on track for another term. And history tells us that first-term governments are usually very hard to defeat. And the last time that a first-term government was defeated was during the Depression all the way back in 1931. But even still taking all of those...
And the government had split too. They'd split into three parts.
Yeah, that's right. But even still, taking all of that into account, the scale of Labor's victory, I think that was the big shock that nobody really expected. But it wasn't really a contest between two strong campaigns. I think that's pretty obvious. It was a campaign of competence from the Labor government and outright disaster for the Liberal Party. And Peter Dutton's campaign was driven almost entirely by fear. I think you referred to that before, David. There were those constant claims about rising anti-Semitism, even though I couldn't see any of it. And there was that endless culture war garbage. There was that talk about government waste and incompetence. But behind all of that noise, there was just virtually no substance. And there was just nothing positive I can remember. There was nothing at all. And the electorate were told very clearly what to be afraid of, but they were never told about how the coalition could improve people's lives on a daily basis. And they had that big nuclear power plan, but that was a total dud and it was totally unbelievable. And the electorate also didn't believe it, as the results show. But in contrast, the Labor government, they did run a cautious campaign. It was probably too cautious, but it stayed focused on stability, stayed focused on competence and presenting itself as a safe pair of hands. So that's probably, I think, the best way to read the election result. Labor won very, very comfortably, and sure, that's because of a very good campaign run by the Labor government, but it's also because of the failure of the Liberal Party campaign as well. And you don't get these sort of opportunities very often in your political life.
No, and I think we do need to acknowledge that Labor ran a very competent, slick and professional campaign, which they generally tended to do, which is why I was a bit pleased with the last couple of elections where incompetent campaigns weren't rewarded. And Labor came out with plans. Now, whether they've followed these plans through is a debate that we'll most likely take up again and again.
But essentially a good campaign is a winning campaign, irrespective of what we might think about it. Whether it's incompetent or not, you look at the scoreboard and think, they won the election, must be a good campaign.
Yeah,
and maybe that's what the problem was with the Liberal Party, where they thought, well, hang on, we won the 2013, 2016, 2019. We ran some pretty incompetent campaigns, but we still won government. And that's probably been their biggest fault.
Having a soft press. Now, I think Dutton didn't have quite as soft a press as Abbott. Nobody said Australia needs Pete, for example, in the way that the Telegraph had that now infamous Australia needs Tony in the last week of that election. Suzanne Lee hasn't been the woman who saved Australia yet in that most embarrassing Gladys Berejiklian profile in The Australian. But it was certainly a softer press than what Labor was getting. And one of Anthony Albanese's strengths is that he is a decent media manager and can get good press into the papers. When things are going bad, suddenly there's a story on Anthony's home life. And it's never inappropriate and it's never grasping and pathetic like Morrison's were. But that type of thing that might go into the weekend supplement or into Woman's Day or Woman's Weekly or New Idea and just softens the image a bit when the image might need softening for some reason. He had the wedding this week and congratulations to him. They were trying to stir up, this was done on public money, and when it wasn't, he'd paid for everything that wasn't already paid for. So it was at his house, essentially. So I don't see why he should have had to pay for using the house that he's renting, even if it's part of his deal. And the security details is part of his salary package, or part of his wages and conditions anyway. But he paid for all the catering and the music and all of that. Even the Telegraph ran a fairly anodyne piece on the Prime Minister got married and these people were there and there was a small private ceremony and there was dancing and he had a bit of a go at DJing, I think. It was just a nice way of managing it. And obviously, private lives are private. So getting the right balance between letting people know this is happening and that it's a good thing and that this is a good look at this and keeping it private is a thing. So, my point is that Labor is managing a pretty feral press a little bit better, although the press can still be feral. And Christmas, they'll get a break in the press till culture war season again. And even then, the Prime Minister tends not to comment on that type of stuff, leaving it to other ministers to explain this is actually okay, no one cares type stuff.
Well, tonight's not the night that we wanted for the Liberal Party or for our coalition or indeed for our country. But we've worked hard every day over the course of the last 3 years to do our best for our amazing country. One of the great honours of being the leader of this party is that we have met people from every side, every corner, the length and breadth of this country. And there are many amazing stories. Now, we didn't do well enough during this campaign. That much is obvious tonight, and I accept full responsibility for that. Earlier on, I called the Prime Minister to congratulate him on his success tonight. It's an historic occasion for the Labor Party and we recognise that. I congratulated the Prime Minister and wished he and Jodie and Nathan all the very best. And I said to the Prime Minister that his mum would be incredibly proud of his achievement tonight, and he should be very proud of what he's achieved. Thank you.
It's an understatement to say that the election campaign went very badly for the coalition, especially for the Liberal Party. And there's been a lot of post-election reports from the respective political parties and from a range of analysts and academics, all agreeing that it was the worst campaign ever by a mainstream political party, and that the leader of the Liberal Party, Peter Dutton, had the lowest ever opinion rating by the electorate. And The results of this can be seen in the final seat tally of 43 seats, one of the worst results ever by the coalition and definitely the worst result ever for the Liberal Party in terms of seats won, its primary vote and the two-party preferred vote. And this was the big story that ran throughout the political year as well. What is the future for the Liberal Party? Are we actually going to see a future for the Liberal Party? And for any organisation, whether it's a business, a public service department or a political party, it's actually hard to have a look at yourself when you're right in the middle of it. But you can see the collapse of the Liberal Party coming in from a mile away. It was obvious to everyone else, but just not to the Liberal Party itself. But I think it just showed that they were intellectually and morally bankrupt, and they were totally disorganised and totally misread the mood of the electorate and didn't learn anything at all from the failures from the 2022 election campaign. And so far, for the rest of the year, since the 2025 federal election, they haven't learned anything from that election result either.
No, it's Western Australia. They came back by doubling their seats by 600%, but they went from two to 6 seats. So that's hardly the triumph. Victoria, to call it a basket case, last time I called it a basket case, a group of insane baskets wrote to me and said, please don't associate us with that. We're much better. New South Wales, who I thought, if I'd been a federal Liberal Party grandee, I'd have been looking at New South Wales as giving us the path back. They've just cut their own head off by replacing a relatively competent leader with an unknown. She may be very competent. I don't know quite enough to state that definitively, but it wouldn't surprise me because getting rid of Mark Speakman made very little sense. One of the few Liberal leaders who was able to hold the tide against that Labor landslide, Eddie.
Oh, but I guess the other point is that he didn't have the cut through that people like to talk about within politics. But there's generally
which state opposition leader does.
Well, that's a very good point. But I guess throughout the year, like this is one thing that did come up throughout most of this year. Like, what is the future of the Liberal Party? Well, I guess we were mainly focusing on what is the future of the federal Liberal Party, and not so much talk about it before the federal election, but after their wipeout. And that's a big question that needs to be asked. And I think we did ask it quite a few times throughout the year, but I think we did see some pretty unusual things that came out of this election. And with the coalition, they just ended up getting 43 seats overall, but the single entity of the Liberal Party, well, that was just reduced to 18 seats across Australia. And I know that's a little bit diluted with the amalgamation of the Liberal National Party in Queensland, but even still, they don't hold that. The nominal Liberal Party members up in Queensland don't hold that many seats anyway. And Peter Dutton losing his own seat as well. And he never really looked like a Prime Minister in waiting for all of that time. And that's not just our opinion. That's the adjudication from the electorate. And even people within Liberal Party circles had really big concerns about the lack of discipline, poor judgment, and a leader who visibly lost confidence as their campaign wore on. And a lot of the messaging, and this still continues after the election, a lot of the messaging that they ran with during the federal election campaign and continue to do up until today, it just sounds like it was written for the Sky After Dark audience, all the anti-woke rants. Maybe it's not as obvious as before, but still got their anti-woke rants, the anti-trans talking points, panic about universities, and the endless outrage at the ABC. And that's always going to fire up the base of the Liberal Party, the conservative base of the Liberal Party, but it's just not the stuff that wins elections and gets you ahead in politics. And on climate change and energy, they still haven't learned anything from the federal election. The coalition has backed itself into a corner, that losing credibility on net zero by 2050, pushing nuclear energy. I think that's still back on the agenda, even though that costs it big time at the May federal election. And they're losing younger and urban voters in the process. And within that collapse of the moderate wing of the Liberal Party, and this sort of happened in New South Wales and well, definitely in Victoria and federally, and the resurgence of that Liberal Party group of hard right partisans, pretty much, that broad church that the Liberal Party always likes to talk about, well, it's not really much of a broad church anymore. And, well, it's not much of a church at all. So the Liberal Party, They're in the wilderness now, and we never know what's going to happen around the corner, David, but based on what we know now, that they'll be in the wilderness for a long time, and based on their performances since the election, they might not have much of a future either.
No, it's hard to see how they can come back. We have competent Labor governments around the states. Even if Jacinta Allen's isn't that popular, there's no way that the Liberal Party in Victoria can come back. And I suspect the next Victorian government will be some kind of minority government. If Jacinta Allen is as unpopular as we are told she is. We were told that Dan Andrews was unpopular and yet came back with increased majorities each time, which is almost unprecedented. They're still trying to get him on a car accident he had 15 years ago. That's how much they're worried about. He's out of office and not coming back. And they're still trying to get him on this car accident, which was fully investigated by the police. It seems like whatever happened has been sorted to the more or less satisfaction of everyone. Jacinta Allen probably doesn't have that dynamic appeal of Dan Andrews, but she's not had any major disaster. There's been a few things that come out, but it's still a fairly competent government. New South Wales, Chris Minns has not exceeded expectations, shall we say. He's barely reached expectations for a Labor government. They're in minority government anyway, but it's hard to see how the Liberal Party in Australia can convert that into a victory. And there's going to be no vote of confidence. Christopher Foley's been more effective than I think everyone expected. I think everyone was expecting a Campbell-Newman government again, but he's been a bit more cautious. Western Australia, forget it. Yeah, they got the extra 4 seats, but they're not going anywhere. If they increase even at that percentage, it's still another 3 elections before they can get back to anything approaching government.
Oh, so it is hard to see what the future of the Liberal Party is. And I guess on some levels, that at the state level, it's not too far. It's not as too far gone as the federal party is, but that the federal Liberal Party, that's where all the problems essentially exist, and it's hard to see how that will change in the foreseeable future. But the other party that didn't do so well at the federal election was the Australian Greens, and they're in a strange situation where their primary vote didn't actually fluctuate that much, but they did lose 3 of the 4 seats that they held in the lower house, including the seat held by their leader, Adam Bandt. But in politics, it's not the amount of votes that you get, it's the amount of seats that you win. That's the most important part of politics. And they're in a strong position in the Senate, but they would have been hoping to springboard those 4 seats that they held in the lower house to maybe 8 seats or more. I thought that they were actually going to win around 6 or 7 seats, but that didn't eventuate, and they're back to where they were before.
Certainly Greens' projections suggested that they were going to get a few more seats. Adam Bandt was hit by some bad luck in that one of the wards in his seat was getting a big development that his voters thought he should have been able to do much more about, even though it was a council thing in Maribyrnong. And he gained in nearly all booths, but lost big in that one. You had Max Chandler Mather, who divided people. Those who thought he was right really thought he was right, but those who thought he was wrong really thought he was wrong. And his upfront personality probably didn't help. So they had a bit of bad luck there. Again, the vote was just spread, and they keep pointing to the National Party, who get about the same amount of primary vote, maybe a bit more, but not an incredibly large primary vote, but end up with 12 or 13 seats, almost guaranteed. The National Party lost 1 seat in the last election, and that was to Andrew Gee, who'd been a member of the National Party and who had stepped down because he was opposed to their policy on The Voice. He wins the seat of Calais against all odds. But the Greens don't have that focused spread. National Party win in Southeast Australia, Queensland, and a bit of Western Australia. They're not really a presence in South Australia, Northern Territory, or Tasmania, whereas the Greens' votes are spread right throughout the country. And
oh, that's right. The Greens have a candidate in every seat. every one of those 150 seats across Australia where the Nationals they don't participate in every seat, maybe even a quarter of those seats.
Yeah, and there's a whole other thing about national roots in their seats, that some of them have been national seats since the formation of the Country Party in 1920 and have remained that way, whereas the Greens, I don't think, have held any federal seat constantly since their formation, and in fact they haven't. They get in occasionally. Yeah, and the big problem with the Greens is that they cover everyone from the Toorak NIMBY, worried about the trees at the back of their house getting cut down, to the Byron Bay hippie wanting to smash capitalism and start the whole thing over again, and everyone in between. It's a much broader church than the Liberal Party, even at its broadest. It's a much broader church than the Labor Party, even at its broadest. It's almost unmanageable. And I know we haven't seen much of Larissa Waters, but I understand there's a lot of backroom stuff going on to try and manage and to get policies out that appease at least everyone in the way that a political party should. So yeah, it's the Greens face, and I've said this consistently, the Greens face a lot of challenges before they can become a viable party of government, no matter how much it may be desirable for them to be the party of government. Is a little way for them to go. I don't think they're dying. I will say that. I think they've had a massive setback, but I don't think it was a fatal setback, unlike the Liberal parties, which seems to have been a fatal setback.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, the best podcast on Australian politics and news commentary. You can support us through Patreon and Substack, and also find us at newpolitics.com.au.
Israel controls Gaza's borders and prevents international agencies from bringing in food. The Israeli-controlled alternative, the notorious Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF, is continuing to be widely condemned. Nowhere near enough food is being distributed. And since May, more than 1,000 Palestinians seeking food have been killed by being shot at GHF sites, or crushed in stampedes as desperate people rush to get food.
The new Israeli aid system is inhumane. It's dangerous.
The issue of Gaza barely featured in the election campaign, but this wasn't accidental. The government didn't want to talk about this because the Liberal Party used pretty much every opportunity to move the conversation over to anti-Semitism and offer their support for Israel, and claiming that the government wasn't doing enough to support the Jewish community in Australia. And for most of this year, the world has watched the ceasefire negotiations collapse. More civilian casualties and more women and children killed by Israel in Gaza, and international law completely ignored. And throughout all of this time, Australia's response has been defined by weakness and timidity. And the Prime Minister and Foreign Minister Penny Wong, they would always speak the language of concern or deep concern, urging restraint and expressing sympathy. But that was about it, David. They continued supplying F-35 parts to Israel. They refused to call for sanctions. And Australia did end up recognising the state of Palestine, but nobody ended up really knowing what this all means. There was no meaningful pressure placed upon Israel to stop its campaign of genocide in Gaza and observe international law and human rights for Palestine. And this was one issue that we constantly called out throughout the year, that this government stood mostly on the wrong side of history and failed to do very much that was meaningful.
It was disappointing. Young radical Penny Wong standing with refugees, going to marches which should have destroyed her career, but her sense of decency shone through. This is before she was Foreign Minister, either being silent or being supportive of, or quietly supportive of, a genocide. Anthony Albanese, who had always been pro-Palestinian. Now, foreign affairs is complicated and compromises have to be made, and I'm also told by people who have access to this that Penny Wong has done a lot of work behind the scenes to try and change Australia's view and to try and help the Palestinian people. To what extent this has been successful, I don't know. I think we have to remember that we need to, that it's not just the Labor Party, that it is also the union movement. Where are the blockades? Where is the refusal? Italy refused to load any parts to Israel. Ireland, Australia, which has been world leaders in this stuff, South African apartheid, for example. Union members still load the ships. Where has the Australian union movement been in not supporting this, in standing up and saying this is wrong and we support our Palestinian comrades? I don't know that you put it in such radical terms anymore, but it's Australia's, particularly from the left, Australia's response has been disappointing, I think.
I think that was one of the most underreported stories of this year, pretty much, was that deep and possibly unbridgeable break within the Labor Party itself. Now, it wasn't public, but the Labor caucus has been totally unified with its support for Israel and paying lip service to Palestine. But for many Labor members, supporters and related activists, the government crossed the basic line. They're acting against its own party platform by not doing very much about Palestine, but also supplying military components to Israel and then denying or then appearing to minimise or deny that extent of that support. And every government is going to make compromise, David. There's no question about that. But there comes a point where the compromise on this type of issue is unacceptable. But the Labor government just seemed to be paralysed on this issue, primarily because it didn't want to offend the Israel and Zionist lobby groups in Australia and didn't want to have this as an issue in the lead up to the federal election campaign. But they call out China whenever they want and make diplomatic noise about that pretty much every single time of the day, or if there's a flotilla in the Philippines, they call that out. But on Israel, no, we're not going to call them out at all. But the point is that the election is now over. That was over 8 months ago or whatever it is, and there's no political excuse now.
I note that Penny Wong's language has become harder. I think we've got to acknowledge that. Not hard enough. We need a total boycott of exports to Israel and imports. It's just disappointing, really. I don't know what's happened to the courage of the left. And you think of the rugby union players who boycotted South Africa and it destroyed their careers. But it was the right thing to do. You think of Jack Mundy and the Green Bands, and it was the right thing to do. And Mundy was called the greatest crook, and he was tied to organised criminals. And they've demonised the CMFEU, most of whom are hardworking, decent people trying to make a living in construction, mining, forestry, electrical, but called criminals, and it's run by bikie gangs, and there's this and there's that, and the chance for them to be seen as taking a principled stand. And they don't. Sally McManus has been totally silent. For a woman who has stood up on principle many times, she's been totally silent, which defeats me. And I'll be fair, maybe I've missed it. Maybe there was a whole thing that I missed. That is possible. And if one of our listeners is there, or if it's even Sally, let us know where she stood up and said, this is wrong. We stand with Palestine. Or we don't stand with Palestine, and this is why. It's the silence that's worse. And with foreign affairs, of course, just to go back, often foreign affairs analysis is not, is this right or wrong, but why was it done this way? Because of the complexities of foreign affairs. Governments often have to do things that they wouldn't do in a domestic situation because of all kinds of factors. But we're not actually getting why, except Hamas is bad. And we're not even told why Hamas is bad. Now, Hamas is bad, but Hamas isn't the whole of the Palestinian population.
One of the most troubling developments over the last year wasn't just about the political silence on Gaza, and there were a few notable exceptions from the Australian Greens and some independents, but the most troubling development has been the attempts to remove the debate altogether. And all across Australia's media landscape, discussion of Palestine has been quietly sidelined or softened or cut off altogether, and sometimes not so quietly. And whenever there are these news reports that can no longer be avoided, it's usually with a pro-Israel position and an anti-Palestinian message. And we did have that case earlier on in the year between the ABC and Antoinette Lattouf, the journalist, who was sacked in 2023 for reposting a factual statement from Human Rights Watch that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war. And the findings of that case were delivered fully in favour of Antoinette Lattouf and totally against the ABC. And David, I think that was a prime example of the Israel lobby hard at work. Shut down debate, cancel journalists who are telling the truth. And in that particular case, well, they didn't win, but it just goes to show how far they will go to silence debate about Palestine. And all of this points to issues of censorship and editorial cowardice, pressure coming in from the Israel lobby. And just during this week, the references that Kerry O'Brien made to Palestine in a speech that he gave at the Walkleys Award, well, they were all edited out when they were published in the Sydney Morning Herald, and I assume in The Age in Melbourne as well. And there was just no explanation that was given for this. And there was also that issue earlier on in the year when News Corporation tried to whip up their anti-Semitism incident at the Cairo takeaway restaurant in Newtown. That didn't work on that occasion. But overall, this isn't just about the one journalist or the ABC or News Corporation. It's just about whether the mainstream media can fulfil a role in providing honest and factual news. And on the issue of Palestine and Gaza, well, they definitely haven't. Independent media, well, we don't have that problem, David. We can say whatever we want, and we always do, but there's definitely a problem for the mainstream media when they bend over backwards to the opinions and to the demands of the Israel and Zionist lobby groups. That's a massive issue.
How many jobs did Antoinette Lattouf cost, really? Okay, she won't be back on the ABC for a while, but Antoinette, as far as I can tell, is doing very well. I saw her that she's on a podcast. We used to be journalists, yeah. And in a changing media environment, she's out of the old style and into the new. Whereas, okay, Ida Buttrose is well in her 80s, but I don't think she's being besieged to join charity boards anymore. Her public career is essentially ended. There was the managing director who had to go, and rightly. I'm not saying these are poor victims of a bent system. These are people who may have been caught in a bent system but could have easily unbent it by just saying no.
And they weren't necessarily forced out, but they sort of thought, well, our positions are untenable, so it's probably best that we go. But there's a few people from that period that are still at the ABC at the moment.
But yeah, the two journalists with News Corp who took the guy to the Cairo cafe and he walked in with his Star of David. And the response was, hi, what would you like?
And why is this guy behaving like a total tool?
Yeah, wear what you want. It's Newtown. For those of you who don't live in Sydney, Newtown's probably the most accepting suburb. You can walk down King Street in your pajamas, no one will care.
Or your Star of David hat. No one really cared on this occasion, but they thought, well, this guy's behaving like a bit of a dickhead, but we'll just let him be, leave him alone. Hopefully he'll go away. Yeah,
and there was no question that they were worried about his Judaism. They were worried about his offensive behaviour as a human being. Those two journalists, I hope, learned a lesson. I get the sense that they were just given a job that they really didn't have the experience to think about.
Well, that was a particular stunt and it failed miserably. But David, it's not just we're focused on the media, but it's not just the media, but throughout the year in universities, arts organisations, festivals, galleries, even in hospitals, we've seen those repeated efforts to suppress pro-Palestinian voices or any sort of Palestinian voice. And we saw talks and workshops cancelled at hospitals, exhibitions were removed or watered down, and quite often
grants were lost.
Yeah, but grants were lost, and quite often it was just done. No consultation, no correspondence. As soon as the complaint was made about anything at all from a Zionist lobby group member, decision made, action taken, and absolutely no concern about the public backlash. But in a lot of these instances, there was a public backlash. When people found out about it, there was outrage. There was outrage. People walked away from these particular festivals that were put on, walkouts within galleries, open letters signed by thousands of people, and public demands for reinstatement, which in quite a few cases did actually happen. But those organisations ended up being publicly damaged. They had these massive PR disasters, yet they always acquiesce. And they probably knew that this would happen, but yet they still continue. No one in these organisations has said, oh, no, cancelling this event or cancelling this person, well, it doesn't align with our principles or our guidelines. It doesn't align with the Human Rights Commission legislation or any sort of discrimination, anti-discrimination legislation. Please piss off, get out of here. But that just doesn't happen. They just say yes, even if it's to their own detriment.
Yeah, and it's so weird because it's a type of power that is perceived power. They might have dirt on some of the heads, maybe, I don't know. But having met some of the arts heads around the country from time to time, they're nice people and they're capable people, but they're not terribly interesting people. I don't know what dirt a lot of them would have.
It might be a case that a problem arises. They want to avoid the problem before it does continue, or they don't want dramas or problems within their organisation. So that's what they do. But you've got to stand up for your principles.
And of course, nobody wants to be considered anti-Semitic or anti-Arabic or anti-Italian. We don't. The perception of being racist when you're not is a horrible thing. And I guess people are worried that, this is anti-Semitic, and not explaining why that conclusion was because they gave money to a Palestinian person and that Palestinian person might. Some of the most outrageous and ridiculous claims came out at the height of it, that people didn't feel safe walking down the main street of Bondi because they were Jewish. I don't believe that. I might believe maybe other towns, maybe, but you'd have to give me specific reasons as to why. I note that over the year, the voices have died down because I think some of them realised this is actually working against us. This is causing genuine anti-Semitism by people who don't know and see that something bad is happening. And of course, the split in the right in the United States is over essentially the right wing, parts of the right wing, either seeing that there's a genocide going on, and it's one thing to defend yourself and to have the right to exist as a country. It's another thing to try and destroy another race and culture. And there are those people on the right who are genuinely appalled, and we applaud and support them, of course. There are those on the right who realised they didn't like Jewish people anyway, who were the genuine anti-Semites, and have started to feel braver in coming out and talking against Jewish people. And of course, the people who get hurt there are innocent Jewish people, not the criminals who are criminals because they're criminals, not criminals because they're Jewish. That's really important to underline here. But they come out against innocent Jewish people who have done nothing to harm anybody. And that, of course, is wrong. It's the weirdest and the strangest thing we're living through at this point. And I think much of the Zionist, you're all anti-Semites, have realised they've overplayed their hand. I said before, I think, if everything's anti-Semitic, then nothing is. And then everything's free game, including genuine anti-Semitism, which we want to avoid. We do not want people to be discriminated against because of their background or their religious beliefs. Their ideas, sure, but not their personal. And of course, a lot of Australian law comes out of Judaic law, the Old Testament, 10 Commandments, build that, and the book of Leviticus, and later the New Testament, of course, which are all Jewish books. So we can be pretty sure that the vast majority of Jewish people practicing Jewish religion are obeying the law. And so there we leave them alone. We support them. We say, of course, some people go to Mass, some people go to church every Sunday, some people go to the mosque, some people go to the synagogue. There's no problem there. You're allowed to do that. You should be allowed to do that, as you should be allowed to not do that. That's what makes Australia a great country, because not every country in the world is like that.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.